Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. This is Rebecca Cummings again. I am a librarian at the Marriott Library and also the political science liaison. So here to help you with your research and scholarship. So hopefully by now you had a chance to watch that last video on finding scholarly sources. And maybe by now you've even found a few where you're like, this is perfect. I want to use this person's ideas and their words in my paper, either to provide context for whatever topic you're talking about, or maybe to shore up your own argument with arguments from experts, maybe even as a counterpoint. Maybe you're like, some people have said this, but I believe this. Either way, when you're using someone else's ideas or words within your paper, you need to utilize citations. And that's what this video is going to be about. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with citations. You've probably been using some form of them since maybe elementary school. But I think if you're like most people, you do citations, but you don't like love citation work. You do enough of them just to kind of pass muster, to check a box, and you hope that you did it well enough to not, raise anybody's like, ooh, this looks terrible. Well, this video, I would like to give you more confidence in doing your citations, to talk a little bit about why we do them, the different styles for doing them, the elements, so that when you are doing your citation work, you can have confidence that you're doing it correctly. Okay, so I'll also give a brief definition of citations. So basically, citations are just giving credit to people when you use their ideas and their words in your research papers. And there are a lot of reasons why we want to cite other people. I think the main reason is probably to establish intellectual context. When you're doing this kind of scholarly research, there's no view from nowhere. Any topic that you're going to write on has been written about by other people. It's been studied, it's been thought about, and you want to make sure that you are establishing yourself as being informed on where the conversation has been up to this point before you start making your own arguments. It's important to think of scholarship as a conversation. So in order to join the conversation and to be effective, you need to know what's been said prior to you entering the conversation. And that's often the point of a literature review or whatever is used in your field. But you can say, this is what's been said up to this point, and then this is where my own voice enters the conversation. The second reason is to give credit where credit is due. If someone else used your words or your ideas, you would want to get credit for them. And likewise, when you're using someone else's words and ideas, you should give them credit. Scholarship, of course, we are trading in ideas and we're building on each other's ideas in order to create new knowledge. And so it's important to give that credit for people when you're using their perfectly worded phrase or using their ideas on a topic. And then lastly, citations are wonderful because they lead us into further research. So if someone has read your paper and they're thinking, I want to know more about this, or I want to know more about that particular thing they talked about, having a wonderful bibliography of citations of sources that you relied upon is a great way to lead other people into new forms of scholarship. Now, there are dozens of citation styles. I mean, maybe there's even hundreds, I don't know, but there's a whole lot of citation styles. But there's a few that are used more commonly than others. And here's two. MLA is a very common form used often in the humanities. It stands for Modern Language Association. The one that you are most likely using in political science and public administration is going to be APA. That's the American Psychological Association. This citation style is currently on its 7th edition, and it gets reviewed every few years to make sure it's hitting the notes of where scholarship is now, adding things when necessary. For example, when DOIs became popular, we'll see that on the next screen, that became added as an essential element of a citation. And the Baldwin 48 or Baldwin 1953, I just wanted to show examples of in-text citations that look different in MLA than APA. In MLA, the convention for an in-text citation is to say the author, no comma, and the page number. And then the date will actually be in the bibliography at the end. In APA, when you're doing in-text citations, you'll have the author, comma, and the date, and then the full citation at the end again. But that lets people know when they're reading your bibliography what particular thing you were citing in text. And it also just shows some differences here stylistically. But the goal of citations is always the same, and that's to help a reader who wishes to consult your sources directly. And so every citation should give a reader the ability to find the specific thing that you're talking about. So bear with me for a moment while we take what looks like a slight detour from citation styles. So I want you to think about something besides academic citations. I want you to think of something that you're maybe more familiar with, and that's a mailing address that you might put on a letter. So you may not think about this, but when you're crafting your either return address or mailing address, you're using a particular convention and you're using a set of elements. And these elements have been thought of in a way that, allows you to convey a specific location in the most economical way possible. So the way that, the elements that we use when we're crafting a mailing address is the name of the recipient, street address, apartment or suite, if applicable, the city, state, and zip code. And what that ends up looking like, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is this right here, that we've created this convention, we've created this particular set of elements that allow all of us to convey information in a standardized way and to help people delivering mail and packages to find that information as quickly as possible. It is no different when you're talking about citations that we use within our papers. Just like a mailing address, citations have elements as well, elements that help identify particular information sources, whether they be books or journal articles or YouTube videos or blog posts or statutes or cases or any kind of information source that you might be using in your paper. Those elements include things like, there's hundreds of elements, but they include things like an author or creator of a source, the date that that source was created or published, more likely, the title of the thing. Sometimes I put source in here because sometimes you're using a thing within a thing. So if you're using a book chapter within a container or source, that's you would have to cite the book title as well. Contributors like editors or illustrators. If you're working with serials or periodicals, journals, you would need a version and number to indicate which exact issue you're talking about. A publisher, a location of that publisher, a DOI, which is a digital object identifier. These are all examples of elements that you could use in different citations. Now, the way that those elements get arranged and in what order and with what punctuation behind it and whether or not it's italicized, that is created by the APA for your purposes. So APA as a group comes together and says, this is how we cite books, for example. This is an example of a book citation on this page. So an APA will say, if you are citing a book, these are the elements you should use, and this is the order, and this is the way you should do it. So like author, period. Date of publication, in parentheses, period. Title, italicized, period. Publisher, period. And then the DOI, which looks like a URL, if available. So here's an example of what that would look like in the real world. Here's a book, Essentials of Public Service, an Introduction to Contemporary Public Administration. It has the authors listed, and the way that they're listed are also according to APA specifications, that you use the last name, comma, first and middle initial, comma, using the ampersand, and then the second author. It's different, again, if you're using different citation styles. I believe MLA, you actually write out the author's first name, but this is how APA would want you to do it. And I know it feels so specific and persnickety, and I'm sorry about that, but this is the way we do it. So there's not too much differentiation between citation styles. So another type of thing that you might cite is a journal article. And in APA, this is how they tell you how to cite a journal article. So author, in this case, there's two authors, author A and author B, and author C, and then with a period at the end, and then the year, again in parentheses with a period, title of article, period, title of the periodical or journal, italicized, comma, volume number, italicized, issue number in parentheses, pages with the DOI. And then again, this is what that would look like in the real world applied to a particular article about Brexit. So I just want to point out, it's the elements that matter and that they're rearranged in different ways to make citations look a very particular way. And I will be completely honest. I have no expectation that most people, the vast majority of people, will ever memorize these rules for how to use APA. But what I do hope you gain is familiarity with being able to identify what kind of information source something is when you see it. So I would hope that as you pay attention to your citations, you start to recognize if something has a volume and issue number, it's a periodical or a journal. That if you see a publisher and a place, that's probably a physical book. So gaining competencies in identifying what citations look like. Okay, I've kind of already talked about this, but it probably at this point you're like, this sounds awful. I have better things to do with my life than figuring out whether or not something should be italicized, or if I, use an author's full first name, or if I just use their initials. And I'll never be able to hold all that information in my head. And that's true. And again, 99.9% of people probably don't need to hold that information in their head. There are some good news when it comes to citations. Most of the time, especially if you're working in places that work with scholarly material, like the kinds we talked about in that last video, the library catalog, databases, Google Scholar, there's almost always an option to cut and paste or export a citation. So here's an example. When you're working in the library catalog, I just found this article on drunk driving and public policy. And then right underneath the article description, you'll find this little button that says citation, and you push on it. And in our library catalog, for example, it allows you to select if you want MLA, APA, Chicago, Harvard, and you just copy and paste that citation. If you get in the habit of doing citations a lot, I highly recommend also using a citation software. And that's where well, for instance, if you were in this view, you could just click on EndNote Basic, it would grab the citation, and then when you're writing, you actually just basically select that and it imports directly into your paper. I can do a separate video on how to use citation software. I think it's so useful, but suffice it to say for this video, there are many options frequently for cutting and pasting. But don't get lazy with the cutting and pasting. Even it says in the library catalog, make sure to check your citations for accuracy. Sometimes the metadata isn't complete and you might have to go in and add some more information. You want to make sure that you're consistently using the same citation style. I've had many professors tell me they actually don't care which citation style someone uses, but they need them to be consistent. As you get into your upper level classes, professors tend to want a particular citation style that's more for your discipline. So again, working in political science and public administration, APA is probably your go-to citation style. So I just gave you the good news on the last slide that most of the time, working with most material, a citation will probably be available to you that you can copy and paste or save to a reference or bibliographic software that you can then just directly upload into your paper. But that's not always the case. There are going to be times, particularly if you're working with non-traditional types of information sources like books and journal articles, you can almost always find a citation. But if you're working with something like a court case, a blog post, a YouTube video, some kind of unusual information source, an email, a data set, and you need to cite that in your paper, it's very likely you are going to have to go make your own citation. And that's why it's also good to have some familiarity with how to make citations. The resource I'm going to recommend highly is Purdue Online Writing Lab. It is a wonderful resource for crafting your APA citations, or even double checking a citation that was given to you to make sure it looks appropriate. So in Purdue, you can go to APA Style 7th edition, which is the current edition. And there's this long list of like, if you need to cite this, this is what you use. If you need to cite this, I put some of that list on here. Articles and periodicals, books, other print sources, electronic sources. So if you need to cite a website, for example. One tip I will give you, I mean, even as a librarian, I rarely put Purdue's URL in my browser. I almost always just Google APA citation plus whatever type of thing. So APA citation website, APA citation court case, APA citation, statute, and it'll take you directly to the page that you need. So for example, if you were searching for how to do legal references, there is a whole page in Purdue on how to cite legal sources. And I did it once again, the element that you need to cite, and then an example of what that looks like. So if you were doing state court decisions, for example, In OWL Purdue, it tells you that the elements that you use are name v name, volume number, US, page number, year, and URL. This is an example of that. The URL, there is no URL because 1954, they didn't have those as part of their citations. And federal state statutes, you would need different information. And this is an example of what that would look like. I will say though, if you're working in our databases like Nexus Uni or Hein Online that uses legal research, again, the databases will offer a citation for the thing that you're citing. So another wonderful reason to use databases is that you don't have to often do your own citation work. So that's citations. Hopefully, we've talked about why you want to use citations, that, you want to give credit to people for their ideas. You want to establish intellectual context. These things are super important. You want to create this bibliography that lead people into different research. But the flip side of that is what you don't want to do. What you don't want to do is engage in plagiarism. When plagiarism is taking someone's ideas and words and passing them off at your own. And if you don't give credit, you are implicitly passing them off as your own. So, and of course, like at the university, there are rules against plagiarism, sometimes that go all the way up to being, failing a class or getting expelled from the university. You are getting a degree based on your own ideas and your own words or your ability to cite other people's words. And so if you are caught through Turnitin software or through your professor's eagle eye as being someone who's engaging in plagiarism, there are some severe consequences for that. So what is plagiarism? It's using someone's sources, using a source's language without quoting. So sometimes you see someone say something just right and you're like, that's exactly what I want to say. Well, that's fine. You can say it, but put quotes around it and put that citation in text and the full citation at the end of your paper. Second, it's using information from a source without attribution. And of course, this can be tricky because there's some information that's just like common knowledge. If you say in your paper, the sky is blue, you don't need to cite something to say the sky is blue. And obviously, it's up to you to figure out whether or not something needs to be cited if you're using someone else's ideas. I think a general rule of thumb is if it's something that you hadn't thought of before or something that you want to, when you read it, you're like, yes, I want to use that person's idea. Go ahead and use that citation. You're never going to get in trouble for doing too many citations in a paper, but you will definitely be in trouble if you use an idea and pass it off as your own. And then lastly, paraphrasing a source in a form that stays too close to the original. So if you see someone said something perfectly, and then you just change a couple words and you're like, it's not plagiarism anymore, that's not true. If you've taken their words and just made tiny tweaks to it, not only will that still get picked up and turn it in, but it is still plagiarism. Either find your own unique way to say it or put quotes around it. Either way, you need to cite it if you're using someone else's ideas. And there are some ways to avoid plagiarism. I genuinely believe most people probably don't want to engage in plagiarism. I think most people intend on, doing their own work. But I think that people run into problems. And so there's some ways of avoiding plagiarism. One, don't wait until the last minute, because if you wait until the last minute to write your paper, it becomes really, really, what's the word? It becomes tempting. That's the word. It becomes tempting to just use other people's words because you don't have a lot of time to craft your own ideas and your own thoughts. And then second, when taking notes for a paper, establish a system for distinguishing your own thoughts and commentary from others. I think this is actually when most people tend to plagiarize, is they see something that someone else said, and they copied and pasted it, put it in their notes, and didn't make a note of who said it and where. And so when you go back, you're like, man, this was a really smart idea that I had. So make sure that when you're taking notes for a paper, I sometimes write mine in all caps if I have what feels like a pretty novel idea, or I will automatically cite it in my notes just so that I know where it was, or even a quick version of a citation so I can find it later. Don't write from someone else's notes because you don't know if it's their original ideas or if they were using words from someone else. Don't take someone else's words and swap just a few out. It's still plagiarism. You're still taking their words. Either step back completely and write your own original thing or just cite them. And then lastly, listen to your own conscience and inner voice. I think it can be, you get to a point where you're like, Do I need to cite that? If you think that, go ahead and cite it. Um, again, I think most of us want to do the right thing. We don't want to engage in plagiarism. And that's what the citation convention is there for, so that you don't have to. So those are my tips for avoiding plagiarism and using citations effectively. Thank you so much for being here, and best of luck with your research. Again, you can always reach out to me at rebecca.cummings@utah.edu. And Rebecca is spelled Rebekah. Best of luck.